Welcome to Mobile Math, math lessons on the go. Today's learning goal, by the end of this lesson, I should be able to multiply a negative number together with another negative number, and I should be able to do that without the use of a calculator. So we'll be multiplying two negative numbers together today. Quick reminder, multiplication is a shortcut for repetitive addition. So 3 times 4 is the same as 3 groups of 4 or 4 groups of 3. So we're going to warm up with multiplying some numbers together just to get our brains going. 3 times 3 would be a positive 9. 3 times 2 is a positive 6. 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 0 is 0. So we can notice there that when we multiply two positive numbers together, they remain positive. So that's the good news. If we continue down this table, 3 times negative 1, that's 3 groups of negative 1. Negative 3, 3 times negative 2, 3 groups of negative 2, and 3 times negative 3 is negative 9. Now this is the big idea from our previous video, that a positive times a negative is a negative value. And we're going to have to keep that idea in mind for the next slide. So here we go. 3 times negative 2, that's 3 groups of negative 2. That's a negative 6. 2 times negative 2, there's a negative 4. 1 times negative 2 is a negative 2. And 0 times negative 2 is a 0. So the first 3 entries, you'll notice, is a positive times a negative gives a negative. So that's our big idea. It still holds. 2 times, or negative 2 times 0 is 0. There is no sign on a 0. And we'll notice here, and this is the important part we're going to see here, to go from here to here, I changed or added 2. To go from here to here, I added 2. I added 2 every single time. So now when we get down to negative 2 times negative 1, we've never looked at two negatives multiplied together here. But if we analyze the pattern and we look at, if I add 2 to 0, I should get a positive 2. If I add a positive 2 to a 2, I should get positive 4. And I will continue with that right through to the end. So 4 plus 2 is a 6. 6 plus 2 is an 8. And if we take a moment to look at that, you'll notice that if we just multiply the magnitudes and don't worry about the signs, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8. So the numbers all follow regular multiplication, but the odd part is these signs. So when we look at this, we'll notice that a negative times a negative gave me a positive. And this is one of the trickiest rules in mathematics to explain. It's misquoted all the time. So our final big idea for today is that a negative times a negative is a positive. And that is a huge idea. It's very tricky. Take a moment, pause it here, read that again, look at the pattern. I will summarize it on the next slide. It looks something like this. So we have been doing positive times a positive for quite a while, so that one should be hopefully okay in your mind. The next two was the big idea from last video, and this is a positive times a negative gives a negative value, and the order of that doesn't matter. And then today's big idea is this last one down here, where a negative times a negative gives a positive value. And that's the real tricky one. So let's try it in practice and see how it goes. Okay, let's try this example. Find the product of negative 9 times negative 8. So that's negative 9 groups of negative 8, which is a little tricky to think about. I've summarized our big ideas up here in the top corner, so they're handy to us. So we're going to try this with two different area models, and the second area model is going to be a little different. We haven't seen one like that before. So I'm going to start here with a negative 5 times a negative 5. So I know 5 times 5 is 25, and a negative times a negative is a positive. I'm going to go to the bottom left corner. 4 times 5 is 20. And a negative times a negative is a positive. Cool. Negative 5 times negative 3, again, I should have 15 as the magnitude, and then negative times a negative is a positive. And lastly, negative 4 times negative 3, if I follow that trend, I should end up with positive 12. When I add all those pieces together, I have 25 plus 15 is a total of 40. And then an additional 32, and I should get a positive 72 in the end. Now, over here in the second area model, I'm going to do something a little different. You'll notice I have a negative 10 plus 2. Well, this is the same as a negative 8. On the left-hand side, I have a negative 10 plus a 1. That's the same as a negative 9. So I'm using my negative numbers in a slightly different way. If I multiply negative 10 times negative 10, I'm going to end up with a 100, and it will be positive. Negative 10 times positive 2 now. I have to be careful here. So negative 10 times positive 2, that's my first big idea from the previous video. I end up with a negative 20. 1 times negative 10 is negative 10. And lastly, 1 times 2 is 2. So now if I add up those numbers, I'll notice I have a positive 100 plus 20 negatives brings me down to 80, plus 10 more negatives brings me down to 70, plus positive 2 gets me to the same answer as 72. So two different models. You may prefer the friendlier numbers in the second model, totally up to you. But we used both of our big ideas in solving those problems. All right, so let's see if we can find a little pattern here, and I'll try and do this relatively quickly. It's not as much work as it may look like. 5 groups of negative 2 is negative 10. Well, you'll notice I have that same amount showing up in the second line. So this piece right here is the same as a negative 10. Well, a negative 10 times a negative 1, if I use my second big idea, should become a positive 10. Now, those 3 pieces from the previous question show up in the next line. So these 3 pieces are all worth a positive 10. A positive 10 times a negative 1 is a negative 10. You probably could see the pattern happening, but let's just do one more here. So those 4 pieces from the previous question all yield a negative 10. Negative 10 times negative 1 goes back to a positive 10. And you could probably guess how the next part of this pattern goes. So I will have a negative 10, a positive 10, a negative 10, and then a positive 10. Now, what we're going to try and just count here to make sure we can see is how many negative signs are in each question. This has 1 negative sign. This one has 2 negative signs. Here we have 3 negative signs. 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And you'll notice that if we look at the sign of the final results, I'm just going to grab my highlighter here, you'll notice this is negative. This was an odd number. This is negative, odd number. Negative, odd number, and lastly, negative, odd number. And that's going to lead to another nice shortcut for solving some of these problems. And that's this. An odd number of negative signs in a multiplication or division problem leads to a negative answer. An even number of negative signs in a multiplication or division problem leads to a positive answer. And I left out my S. Leads. So let's find the product of 4 times negative 9 times negative 3. So I've done this 2 different ways. So the first one, I'm going to multiply a 4 times a negative 9 together. So I know that that will have a negative result. And 4 times negative 9 is negative 36. The next line, I'm multiplying a negative 36 times a negative 3. I would expect a negative times a negative to give me a positive. And it does, and I get 108. Now, I'm going to do the same problem in a slightly different order. This time I'm going to multiply the negative 9 and the negative 3 together, and a negative times a negative will again lead me to a positive. Now I have 2 positives multiplied together, and you'll notice I get the same answer of 108. Okay, if you could press pause on the video and try the following. Find the product for the following 3 questions, so please press pause now. Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to drop the screen here and we'll have a look. So negative 3 times negative 7. 3 times 7 is 21, and a negative times a negative, so that's an even number of negatives multiplied together, should end up as a positive answer. 10 times negative 6, so I have an odd number of negative signs, so I expect my answer to be negative, which you can see it is, and 10 groups of 6 is 60. And lastly, I'm counting up negative signs. I have 3 of them, so that's an odd number of negative signs, so I expect my answer to be negative. 8 times 2 is 16, 16 times 3 is 48, so I end up with a final answer of negative 48. So thank you for watching. Please watch again and pause where you may have had difficulties, and good luck in your future math problems.